The snow had been falling since morning, and by the time the church bell struck 6, the village lay buried under a white silence. Chimneys smoked, windows glowed faintly through frosted panes, and the sound of wagon wheels had long since disappeared. From the road, the world felt hushed, as though the storm itself had swallowed every breath of life. Yet inside a weather-worn cabin on the edge of town, an elderly widow sat by her stove, her hands folded tight, listening to the wind push against the boards. She was used to winter's cruel hand. She had seen more of them than she cared to count. But something about this night carried a strange weight, as if fate itself had chosen her door to be tested. Her cabin was small, simple square of timber that her late husband had built before the war. The beams groaned when the storm pressed. Hard and smoke curled unevenly from the iron stove. She sat wrapped in a shawl, rocking slightly in her chair, listening to the crack of ice outside. The village beyond was quiet, but she knew travelers sometimes lost their way in storms like this. She told herself it was no use worrying, that no one would dare the ridges after dusk. But still she kept glancing at the door, her heart unsettled. It was not long before a sound reached her ears, faint at first, carried on the shriek of wind. A voice. No, 2 voices. She leaned forward, straining to hear. At once a knock came against the wood, hard and desperate. She froze, her hand gripping the arm of her chair. For knocks at such an hour were not common, and not always safe. The storm made cowards of no one, yet few had reason to be out on such a night. Cautious. She lifted the bar from the door and pulled it open just wide enough for the lantern's light to spill out. There, hunched in the snow, stood a tall figure. Cloaked in furs, his skin dark beneath the hood, eyes sharp, even in the dim. Beside him leaned a pale woman, her cheeks raw from wind, her hair tangled and half frozen to her shawl. They both looked near collapse, their breath misting in frantic clouds. The widow hesitated, her mind racing. I've lived long enough to know the sight of an Apache man, though most in the village spoke of them with fear, whispering about raids long past. To see him here, holding fast to a white woman as though his very life depended on her, was something that would stir talk. For years. Yet what she saw in their faces was not threat, but exhaustion. It's not cruelty, but need. Without another thought, she unlatched the door fully and beckoned them in. They stumbled across the threshold, dripping snow onto the planks, their clothes stiff with ice. The man lowered the woman gently onto a stool near the fire, his hand never leaving hers. His body crouched as though shielding her from even the heat itself. The widow caught the quiet glance that passed between them, and though no words were spoken, she understood more than she cared to admit. She busied herself at once, setting a kettle on the stove, fetching blankets from the chest. Her hands trembled. Not from age, but from the strange tension that had crept into her cabin. She was alone no longer, and the company she now kept was one that most villagers would not tolerate. Yet here they were, bound together by something deeper than survival. She could see it in the way the woman's eyes softened when she looked at him, in the way his hand lingered at her shoulder with a gentleness that defied every cruel tale. Ever told of his people, the storm rattled the shutters, as though eager to remind them they had no choice but to stay under her roof. The widow poured steaming tea into chipped cups, watching them carefully. The woman tried to speak, but her lips quivered from cold, and the Apache man simply bowed his head in quiet gratitude. The fire cast long shadows across the room, and in those flickering lines, the widow felt a strange warmth stir within her chest, part pity, part awe. She wondered what had brought them together, what road had forced them to rely on each other. When the world outside still clung to old hatreds, she wondered, too, what danger might follow them. For travelers in storms were rarely without a reason. Her heart tugged between fear and compassion, but her voice betrayed nothing as she urged them to drink, to warm themselves, to rest. Outside, the snow thickened. The village slept, unaware that under her roof a story was beginning, one that could not easily be hidden once daylight came. She thought of the gossips at the general store, of the preacher who preached against sins of the flesh, of the sheriff who had little patience for strangers. She thought, too, of the young woman's weary eyes, and of the Apache's hand that held hers with quiet devotion. The hours passed slow. the wind howling like wolves beyond the walls. The widow found herself listening not to the storm, but to the soft exchange of whispers between the two strangers. Yet their words were low, sometimes broken by silence. Yet even without meaning, she could feel the tenderness woven into them. The woman leaned against him, her exhaustion plain. He pulled her close with care that spoke louder than speech. The widow rocked in her chair, staring at the fire, her mind restless. Something inside told her this night would change everything. She had taken them in, and now their secret was her own. But secrets had a way of spilling, and she feared what morning light would bring. The storm could not last forever. When it passed, the world outside would demand answers she did not yet have. For now, the three of them sat bound together by fire and storm, each carrying truths unspoken. The widow's heart stirred with questions, but her lips stayed still. She only listened, watched, and waited as the snow climbed higher against her door, and the night stretched on without mercy. And when a sharp sound echoed outside, whether branch or boot, she could not yet tell her. Blood ran cold, for she knew the storm was not the only force waiting beyond her walls. The widow kept still in her chair, her eyes on the door, though her body ached to move. The sharp sound outside had faded back into the storm, but it had been real too clean, too sharp to be the wind alone. She listened hard, straining past the groan of timbers and the whistle through the chimney. Nothing came again, but the weight of it stayed. She glanced toward the two strangers. The woman had dozed against the Apache's shoulder, her face pale and lips cracked, while he sat upright, his dark eyes fixed on the same door that troubled the widow. We had heard it too. They remained that way for a long while, the fire snapping, shadows flickering, every gust of wind pulling their thoughts toward the world outside. The widow's hands fidgeted in her lap. She told herself that she had weathered storms before, that her walls had held through worse winters, yet it was not the snow she feared. It was the eyes of men, the talk of the town, the judgment that would fall like a hammer if word reached them, of who now sat beneath her roof. At length, the Apache stirred. His gaze shifted toward her, steady but not unkind. Safe. In halting English, the word heavy on his tongue, she blinked, taken aback that he spoke at all. Few in town would believe he could, let alone with such clarity. She nodded, though her heart was far from certain. Safe enough for the night, she answered softly. The woman stirred then, opening her eyes. She looked weary still, but there was relief in her face at hearing the exchange. We lost our way, she whispered, her voice rough from cold. We had no choice but to keep walking. The widow poured more water into the kettle, letting the steam rise and fill the room. She did not press for details. If they wished to tell their tale, they would, and if not, then silence was perhaps the wiser course. Still curiosity gnawed at her. Few traveled these hills in winter. Few were still together, in such company. She stole glances at them as she worked. The woman's clothes, though torn and stiff with snow, spoke of a better life once sturdy wool, not the thin rags of drifters. The Apache wore buckskin beneath his heavy coat, the edges decorated with careful stitching that caught the firelight. His moccasins were caked with ice, yet his posture remained strong, as if hardship had long been his companion. The widow remembered tales told in hushed voices at quilting bees and in pews on Sunday mornings, tales of raids, of women taken, of blood spilled on the edges of town. Yet here, before her, the truth looked nothing like those stories. The man's eyes were sharp but not cruel, his hands gentle as he lifted the woman's cup to her lips. And the woman, far from afraid, leaned close to him, her trust plain as day. The kettle hissed, breaking her thoughts. She set bread on the table, cut rough slices with her worn knife. The crust was hard, but it would fill their bellies. She placed it before them without ceremony. They ate slowly, with the quiet hunger of those who had gone too long without warmth or food. The widow sat back, chewing her own piece, though her eyes never left the window. It was then that she noticed how the woman's hand trembled when she lifted the bread. The Apache steadied her wrist without a word, his touch sure and protective. The widow saw the faintest smile tug at the woman's lips, and something in her chest tightened. It was love unmistakable, unashamed, though the world outside would brand it forbidden. The hours deepened. Storm pressed harder, rattling the shutters, piling snow high against the door. The widow's candle guttered, leaving only the orange glow of the stove. They spoke little, but the silence between them was not empty. The widow found her thoughts wandering back through years, to when her husband had still been alive, when their small cabin had rung with laughter and children's feet. They had been buried now, one by one, her family scattered to the graveyard and the earth. She had grown old alone, her only company the shifting seasons and the creak of wood in the night. Yet now, with these strangers before her, she felt a stir of something long forgotten, reminder that life still carried stories. Even in its twilight years, the Apache's gaze flicked again toward the door. He set his bread down and rose quietly, moving to the window. He lifted the curtain just enough to peer into the dark. Snow swirled outside, but the widow saw his shoulders tense, his breath drawn sharp. He lowered the cloth, then returned to his seat without a word. The widow dared not ask. But the weight of his silence told her enough. Something waited beyond the storm. Whether man or beast, she could not yet know. The woman's eyes followed him anxiously, her hand clutching at his sleeve. He gave her a small nod, the kind that carried comfort without sound. She leaned against him again, and for a moment the cabin felt more tender than tense. Yet the widow knew better than to trust peace when storms still raged. She busied herself with more chores, straightening blankets, stoking the fire, sweeping stray snow from the floorboards. Anything to quiet her hands. She told herself that morning would bring clarity, that the light of day would wash away the fears that haunted the night. But morning also meant eyes, neighbors, townsfolk, men who would question why she had opened her door to those the world called enemies. The widow sat once more, her chair creaking as she rocked. She closed her eyes briefly, but rest would not come. Each time she drifted, the memory of that sharp sound outside jolted her back. The storm might cloak them for now, but she knew too well that danger often waited for silence, not noise. The fire crackled, the storm wailed, and inside her small cabin, 3 souls held fast against both. Yet beneath the warmth, threads of fear wound tighter. Who were these 2 strangers, and what path had bound them together through such peril? Why had fate carried them to her door, and what would it demand of her when morning came? Her gaze fell once more on their joined hands, on the fragile strength that bound them. And though her heart whispered warnings, another voice deeper still urged her to protect them, no matter the cost. For in their weary eyes, she saw not danger, but love, a love the storm itself could not smother. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it a sound unmistakable this time, the crunch of footsteps. In the snow, the widow's breath caught. The Apache's head snapped up. The woman's fingers gripped his arm with sudden fear. The night was far from over, and already the storm was no longer the only thing pressing at her door. The widow's heart pounded as the sound of footsteps pressed through the snow outside. They came slowly at first, muffled by the storm, but they were too steady to be mistaken for falling branches. She held her breath, her eyes darting to the strangers in her cabin. The Apache had already risen, his tall frame tense in the dim light, every muscle alert. The woman clung to his sleeve, her lips parting as though she wanted to speak, but no words came. The widow's mind raced. Few folk ventured out on nights like this unless driven by need or suspicion. She thought of the sheriff, of the deacons, of farmhands who filled the saloon with harsh talk. Of these 2, if word had spread, she shuddered. No good could come of it. The footsteps stopped. Silence pressed in, heavy as the snow itself. Then came the soft scrape of boots shifting, and a knock on the door, not desperate like before. Firm, measured, the widow froze in her chair. She had lived long enough to know the weight of such knocks. They were not the calls of the lost, but of those who expected answers. She looked toward the Apache. His eyes met hers, sharp and unwavering. He gave a single shake of his head. A warning. The knock came again, louder this time.
"Ma'am?" A voice called through the wind, muffled but distinct. "You awake in there?" The widow's throat tightened. She knew that voice. It was Tom Fletcher, one of the town's watchmen, a man whose nose was always pressed where it didn't belong. He was known for hauling rumors like firewood, and once he got a story, he carried it straight to the sheriff. The Apache moved closer to the woman, shielding her with his body. She looked small behind him, her pale face pale still with fear. The widow rose slowly, steadying her hands against her skirts, and made her way to the door. Her old bones felt heavier with each step. She cracked the door just enough to meet the storm and Fletcher's shadow. Snow clung to his hat brim, his lantern swinging at his side. His eyes, sharp and curious, narrowed at her. "Evening," he said, his tone carrying a forced casualness. "Saw light in your window. Thought I'd best check you hadn't froze." "Up out here?" The widow forced a smile, though it felt brittle. "I've weathered worse storms than this, Tom. No need to worry yourself." Fletcher leaned a bit, peering past her shoulder. The widow shifted, blocking his view. "Storm's bad," he went on, his voice carrying an edge. "Not fit for man nor beast. You ain't seen anyone on the road, have you? Folks been talking of strangers moving through." Her pulse quickened. She shook her head slowly. "Ain't seen a soul," she said firmly, praying her eyes did not betray her. For a moment Fletcher studied her, the snow whipping about his lantern glow. Then he gave a stiff nod. "Well, you take care. If you do see anyone, best let the sheriff know. Dangerous times." The widow murmured a farewell and closed the door before he could say more. She leaned her weight against it, her breath shuddering out of her chest. Behind her, the Apache stood silent, his face unreadable, though his eyes held the sharp gleam of one who understood too well the danger outside. The woman reached for his hand, squeezing it tight. The widow turned, her hands trembling. "He'll be back," she whispered. "He always comes back when he smells something." The Apache gave no reply, but his jaw tightened. The widow knew then that her quiet cabin had become a tinderbox. The storm could bury their tracks for now, but once the snow cleared, tongues would wag, and eyes would search. The night stretched long after Fletcher's departure. The woman dozed fitfully by the fire, her face pressed against the Apache's shoulder, while he sat awake, his gaze fixed on the shadows. The widow tried to close her eyes in her rocker, but every creak of timber, every gust of wind, pulled her back to Wakefulness. Her thoughts wandered down darker paths. She remembered how the townsfolk had spoken when she was younger, how quick they were to condemn what they did not understand. She thought of the preacher's sermons, of the harsh lines drawn between us and them. If Fletcher discovered the truth, there would be no mercy, not for the Apache, and not for the woman who chose his company, and perhaps not even for the widow who dared to shelter them, but her heart would not let her turn them out. She had seen the look in their eyes, the quiet devotion that bound them together. It reminded her of her own youth, of stolen glances across fields, of the fierce loyalty of love when the world set itself against you. Toward dawn the storm eased, though the wind still moaned through the trees. The widow stepped outside briefly, her boots sinking deep into drifts. The village lay hidden beneath a white shroud, the rooftops and fences nearly buried. She saw no fresh tracks, though she knew the snow would not hide them forever. When she returned inside, she found the Apache standing near the door, as if ready to defend it with his life. The woman stirred awake and caught the widow's eye. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse, but filled with gratitude. The widow gave her a nod, though her chest ached with worry. As the light of morning bled through the frosted panes, the cabin seemed smaller, the air tighter. The storm had hidden them through the night, but daylight would reveal too much. The widow feared the watchman's words would already be weaving through town. And so the conflict thickened. The Apache knew he could not linger here without drawing fire upon them all. The woman, weary and frail, had little strength left to press on through the cold. The widow, torn between duty to her neighbors and compassion for those in her care, found herself standing at a crossroads she had never expected. Her mind wandered through possibilities. Could she hide them in the old root cellar, unseen until the storm broke further? Could she send them deeper into the hills, away from the town's gaze? Each thought carried risk. Each choice carried weight. Meanwhile, whispers of the storms. Survivors, if Fletcher's suspicions grew, would fan through the streets. And in that small village of the late 1800s, where trust was fragile and fear was quick, such whispers had power enough to ruin lives. The widow sat once more in her chair, staring at the fire while the strangers huddled close behind her. She could almost hear the voices of her neighbors already, sharp with judgment, cruel with certainty. Yet against those imagined echoes, she saw again the woman's trembling smile, the Apache's steady hand. The tension in the cabin grew thicker than the smoke curling in the rafters. No one spoke of what might come next, but all of them felt it. The storm outside had passed, but another storm, fiercer still, gathered beyond the widow's door. And as the day grew brighter, a distant sound carried faintly through the air, the tolling of the church bell calling the village to gather. The widow's breath caught, for she knew what followed gatherings. Questions, talk, the spreading of suspicions. The strangers inside her home were no longer hidden by night. The widow closed her eyes, her fingers tightening on the arms of her rocker. The choice was coming. The peace of her long solitude was gone, and her cabin had become the heart of a conflict that could not stay secret for long. And somewhere beyond the snowdrifts, she felt certain Tom Fletcher was already telling his story. The church bell rang steady through the cold air, its sound carrying across the white fields like a summons that could not be ignored. The widow sat stiff in her rocker, her hands clasped together, listening to the echoes fade. She knew what it meant. The villagers would gather, their talk sharpened by suspicion, their eyes eager for anything that might distract them from the endless winter. In a place as small and tight as this one, rumors traveled quicker than the wind. The Apache stood near the door, his figure tall and still as a statue. He had not spoken much since the knock in the night, but his silence carried its own weight. The woman sat close to the fire, wrapped in a blanket, her cheeks still pale but her eyes clearer now. She looked toward the widow with quiet gratitude, though fear lingered beneath her expression. The bond between the two of them was plain, carved into every glance, every small gesture. It was the kind of bond that no law or sermon could break. Yet the widow knew too well what her neighbors would make of it. She rose from her chair, her joints aching, and moved slowly to the window. Pulling back the curtain just enough, she saw faint trails of smoke curling from chimneys in the distance. The storm had buried much, but the village was stirring now. Life would return to its routine, and with it, judgment, when she turned back. To them she spoke low but firm. You cannot stay here. Not once the sun is high. They'll come looking. The woman's lips parted as though she wanted to argue, but no words came. The Apache's gaze remained steady. He gave the smallest nod as if he had already known the truth. I have a root cellar out back, the widow continued, her voice trembling but determined. It's hidden beneath the drift. You'll be safe there for a time. When night falls again, you can take the ridge path. It's long, but it will lead you away from the valley. The woman's eyes filled with tears. Why help us? She whispered. The widow paused. She looked at them, two souls bound together in a way the world called wrong. But she knew in her heart it was nothing but right. Because I see what others choose not to, she said softly. I see the truth in your faces. And I have lived long enough to know love is not the enemy men say it is. The Apache placed a hand over his heart and bowed his head slightly. It was all the thanks he needed to give. The widow wasted no more time. She fetched her heavy cloak and led them through the back door, her boots crunching deep in the snow. The storm had left high drifts, but her hands knew every inch of her land. She brushed aside the snow until the wooden hatch revealed itself, half buried and stiff with ice. Together, they lifted it, the hinges groaning, and revealed the dark hollow beneath. "You'll be warm enough with the blankets," she told them, her breath clouding in the cold. "I'll bring food at dusk. No one will think to look here. Not while the snow's still high." The woman clutched her hand briefly, her fingers trembling. The Apache met her eyes once more, and the widow felt the weight of his trust settle heavy upon her shoulders. Then they descended into the cellar, and she lowered the hatch above them, sealing their secret away. The day stretched long. The widow returned to her cabin, forcing her body into the rhythm of chores. She baked bread, swept the floor, mended a tear in her shawl. All the while, her ears strained for sounds of boots on her porch, for the knock she dreaded. And before noon, it came. Tom Fletcher again, his hat dusted with snow, suspicion burning in his eyes. "Morning, ma'am," he said with false cheer. "Snow's easing. Sheriff asked if I might check around. You sure you ain't seen anyone?" The widow's heart hammered, but she steadied herself. "No one but the storm," she answered, her voice calm. "If there were souls out there last night, the snow's buried them by now." Fletcher squinted, glancing past her shoulder again. She held her ground, her small frame firm in the doorway. At length, he tipped his hat. "Strange tracks out. By the ridge. Could be nothing. But best keep your door barred tonight." She gave a stiff nod and closed the door on him once more. This time, she pressed her back against it, letting her breath rush out. She knew the danger had not passed, but she also knew she had bought time. The hours dragged until dusk. She carried a basket out through the drifts, her lantern light low, and slipped it into the cellar. The woman's hand reached up from the dark, her eyes glistening with gratitude. The Apache took the basket silently, but the weight of his gaze said more than words. That night, as the village slept, the widow sat in her chair, staring into the fire. Memories came to her of her own husband, of the hardships they had endured, of the love that had bound them through war and famine. She thought of how the world had judged them in small ways too, when they had first married young, when their crops had failed, when their children had fallen ill. Judgment, she realized, was as constant as the seasons. But love was rarer and worth protecting at any cost. When dawn broke again, she knew it was time. She led the two from the cellar, their faces pale but determined. The storm had softened, leaving the hills draped in quiet. The ridge path waited, hidden under snow. Winding into the horizon dot, the woman embraced the widow tightly, whispering her thanks over and over, tears freezing on her lashes. The Apache gave her a final bow, his eyes meeting hers with silent respect. They turned then, their figures small against the vast white, moving together step by step into the distance. The widow watched until they were gone, until the snow swallowed them whole. Then she returned to her cabin, her breath catching in the cold air. She felt lighter somehow, though she knew the risk she had taken might still haunt her. Yet in her heart she carried no regret. She had chosen compassion over fear, truth over rumor, love over judgment. In the days that followed, Fletcher came again, and others too, their questions sharp. But the widow only shook her head, her voice steady. "No strangers here," she told them, her eyes unflinching. And though suspicion lingered, nothing could be proved. The village carried on, the storm forgotten in the steady rhythm of daily life. But the widow remembered. Each night she sat by her stove, she thought of the two travelers, of the love she had sheltered for one short winter's night. She wondered where the ridge path had taken them, whether the world beyond would grant them the peace her village never could. her cabin returned to its quiet, yet it did not feel as empty as before. For within its walls she had witnessed something. Rare a love strong enough to defy a storm, strong enough to challenge the weight of the world. And though she remained alone, she carried that memory like a flame in her chest, warming her through the coldest nights. The snow melted with spring. The fields greening once more. Life in the village continued as it always had, bound by old rules and harsher judgments. But the widow knew she had chosen differently, and that choice gave her a kind of peace. Years later, when her hands grew frail and her hair turned white, she still thought back to that storm, to the knock at her door, to the faces of the Apache, and the woman who leaned against him, their love shining through the frost. It was a story she never told aloud, not to neighbors nor to kin. Yet in her heart, it remained the truest story she had ever lived. And in the quiet of her final winters, when the wind howled against her cabin and the snow pressed high against the door, she smiled to herself. She knew love was no enemy. Love was the only thing that ever truly endured.